Today is 22nd January 2026, and let me take this opportunity before I begin this program to remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel if once you've watched this program you decide that you like what you've heard and wish to indicate that fact. Well, I have said at various points over the course of this Greenland crisis, if crisis is what it is, that sooner or later, in some form or other, the European powers, the big European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, would gang up together and they would persuade Denmark to agree in some way or other to hand over or sell Greenland to the United States. And in my opinion, the first big step in that direction was taken yesterday. And the form it took was an agreement, a deal, as President Trump refers to it, a deal between him and Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. And apparently, Rutte and Trump negotiated together and came to some sort of an agreement with each other about the future status of Denmark. It's perhaps worth pointing out at this point that this doesn't seem to have been, or at least in the way that Trump and Rutte are presenting it, it doesn't seem to have been a case of Rutte making some suggestions to Trump and suggestions to the Danes, which the two sides might take forward and discuss with each other to see whether they might form the basis of a future agreement between the two of them. Rather, what actually seems to have happened is a straightforward, direct negotiation between, in effect, the NATO Secretariat and President Trump of the United States, at the conclusion of which an agreement between them was supposedly reached. So this now is the policy. This agreement is now the policy, the objective, the outcome that the NATO Secretariat appears to have committed itself to. Now, already to me, that begs massive questions. Who is Mark Rutte, as Secretary General of NATO, which is a military alliance and a supranational body? Who is he to negotiate about the territory of a country, Denmark, which is a member state of NATO, certainly, but which is, of course, a country with sovereign rights and which one would expect to negotiate issues concerning one of its territories for itself. If Mark Rutte has been given some kind of negotiating authority by Denmark to negotiate on its behalf, I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware that the Danish Parliament has been consulted about it. I'm not aware that the authorities in Greenland, who are the topic of this negotiation, have been consulted about it either. Yet Mark Rutte steps in and holds a discussion on this sort of question, this very question, with the President of the United States. And the President of the United States is touting a deal, and he says that in light of that deal, he is not going to impose the 10% tariffs on the 8 European states, members of NATO and of the EU, which he said he would impose, he now says, on the 1st of February, or specifically on the Greenland issue. And, well, we don't have official confirmation of what this deal amounts to, but the Daily Telegraph in London and Axios in the United States have provided some of the details for us. Briefly, it seems that Mark Rutte has said that the United States can have sovereign rights over areas, territories within Greenland, where it will establish bases. In other words, these bases will be formally the territory of the United States, the analogue being the kind of base rights that Britain has in the island of Cyprus, which is, of course, not just an island, but a nation as well, as part of the negotiations leading to Cyprus's independence from the British Empire in the 1950s and early 1960s. The Cypriots were obliged to cede part of their sovereignty over part of their territory to Britain so that Britain could retain certain military bases and extra territorial rights in Cyprus. And supposedly, allegedly, apparently, this is the formula that Mark Rutte has not just proposed, but apparently agreed with the President of the United States. And apparently, it's mostly about bases, but it's also about other things. Apparently, the United States also is going to have all kinds of rights to the strategic minerals in Greenland and all of those sort of things. Mineral rights, mining rights, and all which comes with that. As I said, no sign that Denmark itself, or indeed Greenland, were involved in these negotiations. And as I understand it, as of today, the Danes are complaining about this. They are saying that there is still no agreement as far as they're concerned. They're saying that whatever Mark Rutte discussed with the Americans, the President of the United States, it has no legal force unless and until Denmark itself agrees to it. And as far as Denmark is concerned, there is no deal. And the negotiations, of course, have not even begun. Well, that may very well be true, but the reality is that Mark Rutte would not have reached these agreements with President Trump if he was not confident that he had the backing of the major European powers, Germany, Britain, France, probably Italy as well. And I'm going to go further than that. I'm going to say that in this negotiation that he conducted, he was almost certainly acting at the request and with the authority of the major NATO powers, other than the United States, of course. So there it is, a negotiation carried out over Denmark's head. Denmark not consulted or informed about it in advance, apparently, and the Danes are going to be presented with it, and it will be essentially a take it or leave it deal. You have any doubt about that? See the article today, which is there in the Daily Telegraph by David Blair, a very well-connected journalist in Britain, and one who I have no doubt at all is reflecting the opinion of the British government. He puts it like this: no matter how the agreement is dressed up, it would still involve an independent state being bullied and browbeaten into sacrificing sovereign territory, violating the first principle of a peaceful and orderly world, which is the business big countries cannot be allowed to dismember small ones. The territory in question might be remote and uninhabited, but the vital principle would still be broken. Worst of all, the threats have come from Denmark's NATO ally, the very country which is bound by treaty to go to war to defend NATO territory. So giving the United States sovereign base areas on Greenland is, in all frankness, a terrible solution. But then here comes the clincher. But it might be a necessary one for the simple reason that the alternative would be even worse. If Trump were to use force against an ally, this would destroy NATO and release all manner of dangers upon Europe and the wider world. If Denmark makes this sacrifice, it will be acting for the sake of the rest of us. We should be grateful. So there it is. Denmark being told to sacrifice part of its sovereignty, to sacrifice all part of its territory so that NATO can be preserved through an agreement negotiated over Denmark's head by NATO itself, the NATO Secretariat, taking it upon itself to negotiate directly with the United States government, with Denmark basically being told, this is what you must agree to. And notice the words that in David Blair's article, who, by the way, proposed this very idea of the United States being given sovereign base rights in Denmark, something which, by the way, begs some questions with me. Was this an idea that was circulating in London? David Blair insists it was exclusively his idea, but I do wonder, in light of what has happened. Anyway, never mind. Let's not get distracted with that. But anyway, Denmark being told that it must agree to this, and in return, we will all be grateful to Denmark because it has sacrificed its sovereignty for its friends. Well, there it is. Now, beyond that, of course, it's most unlikely that it will end with this. President Trump is already talking about giving $1 million to each Greenlander, presumably on the principle that he can buy them. And if he can buy them, then he can have it all. And he's already making comments about the fact that under this deal, the United States can be anywhere in Greenland that it wants. You give the United States a little, you sacrifice the principle of sovereignty and of territorial integrity. At some point, my own view is that the United States will get it all. Many people are seeing the agreement that was made yesterday as a climb down by Trump. I don't see it in that way in the slightest. It seems to me, on the contrary, that the Europeans, via NATO, are in the process of giving Greenland to the United States, to Trump, on a plate. The only thing that they're doing is that they're doing it in stages, piece by piece by piece. Now, I mentioned Cyprus, but of course, Cyprus had to surrender part of its territory to Britain in order to get independence from the British Empire. In 1922, Ireland did exactly the same thing. It had to accept that part of its territory in the north of Ireland would be retained by Britain, and that the British would also retain base rights in the west of Ireland. It was bitterly unpopular and very controversial in Ireland, and it led to a brief civil war, but it was the outcome that the British Empire was able to impose. Denmark has never been part of the United States. It is not part of the American empire. It is not correct, as President Trump says, that the United States has ever held Greenland as part of its own sovereign territory. The United States did occupy Greenland for a certain period of time during the Second World War, when Denmark itself was occupied by Germany. But as far as I'm aware, during that period, the US did not challenge ultimate Danish sovereignty, and at the end of the war, it returned Greenland to Greenland to Denmark as part of the various agreements that took place at the end of the Second World War. So Greenland is not gaining independence from the United States. Denmark is not gaining independence from the United States. This is not a stage in the struggle of a country, a nation, against an imperial overlord, in which it has to make sometimes very painful concessions in order to rid itself of that overlord. Rather, it is the diametric opposite. It is a weak nation having to make territorial concessions of extraterritorial and sovereign rights to an imperial overlord who is now coming in and who will plan or may eventually seek to take it all. People in India will know exactly how this process works. In China too. This also happened in the late 19th century and early 20th century, though in China it never reached its logical conclusion, largely because of the enormous resistance that the Chinese people put up to this process. But, well, it has taken China a huge amount of time to regain control of its territory. The Chinese would say that it is a process which, given the situation in Taiwan, is still not complete. But the point is that in Denmark and with Greenland, it apparently has just started. And the Europeans, the European states, and of course the NATO Secretariat are complicit in this process. Well, there it is. I am not going to spend more time on this particular agreement and on the mechanics of it. I find this whole thing sordid and shabby, but it exposes yet again the profound underlying weakness of the Europeans, of the European leadership, and their extreme dependence on the United States and their psychology of dependence as well. And, by the way, their continued obsession with Russia and with Ukraine. Even as this crisis in Greenland was boiling, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, was still telling everybody that we must not forget the crisis in Ukraine. When are we ever allowed to? Anyway, that's what she said. Friedrich Merz continues to say that the Russians show no interest in peace. We will come to all of that in a moment. I've read commentaries in the British media now, which openly admit that the priority of the British government, of Keir Starmer specifically, is to keep the United States still committed to NATO and above all, or at least most immediately, still committed to the fulfillment of Project Ukraine. Everything, dignity, honor, sovereignty, must be sacrificed to that objective. And frankly, I find the shabby way in which the European states that have basically colluded to start this process, the shabby way in which they're hiding behind the NATO Secretariat and the NATO Secretary General, I find it, well, all I will say is it makes my stomach turn. They didn't even have the courage and the dignity to do it themselves. They had to get Mark Rutte, who is essentially a bureaucrat now, to do it for them. Well, there it is. That's them. Now, one person who has been teasing, ridiculing the Europeans about this whole process, and who has been busy making as much trouble between them and the Americans on the Greenland issue that he can, is, not surprisingly, President Putin of Russia. Over the course of a meeting of Russia's Security Council, which has recently taken place in the Kremlin, well, he discussed this whole process, the whole Greenland issue, and, well, he said this: as for Greenland, what is happening around Greenland does not concern us in any way. However, we do have experience of resolving similar issues with the United States. In the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, in 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States, and the United States purchased it from us. As I remember, the area of Alaska is 1.7 million square kilometers, slightly more. The United States purchased Alaska for $7.2 million. These figures should, of course, be checked, but to the best of my recollection, this is correct. In total prices, adjusted for inflation over all these decades, this amount would come to around $158 million. The area of Greenland, meanwhile, is slightly over 2.16 million square kilometers. That is, roughly speaking, about 449,000 to 450,000 square kilometers more than Alaska. If we compare this with the price paid to us by the United States for Alaska, the price paid for Greenland should be somewhere in the range of $200 to $250 million. If we compare this using gold prices at the time, the figure would likely be higher, perhaps approaching $1 billion. But I think the United States would be able to afford that as well. I mean, the irony here is cruel. $1 billion for Greenland. More importantly, Denmark and the United States also have their own historical experience in this regard. As far as I can recall, in 1917, Denmark sold the Virgin Islands to the United States, so precedents exist. Denmark has always treated Greenland as a colony and has governed it rather harshly, not to say brutally. But that is a different matter and is unlikely to be of interest to anyone today. Well, of course it is. It is a concern to the people of Greenland. But again, when he says brutally, I mean, he's being absurd. I mean, one can criticize Denmark's treatment of the people of Greenland. Maybe it was brutal in the past, but I doubt that many would use that word to describe it today. And anyway, he goes on to say, this certainly does not concern us. I believe they will sort it out for themselves. So he's piling on salt onto Denmark's wounds. He has no reason to like Prime Minister Frederiksen. He says, what are you worried about? You've done it already. You gave away, you sold the Danish Virgin Islands to the United States in 1917. We, of course, have done the same thing with Alaska. You've treated Greenland very badly. It's not really, you don't really take it seriously as a part of your country. You treat it instead as a colony. So why don't you just sell it to the United States and get the whole business over with? And, well, as for the price, well, $1 billion should cover it. Not 800 billion, not the 57 billion that Donald Trump is talking about now, if he does indeed pay $1 million to each Greenlander. Rather, just $1 billion. And in light of what you are and what you've done, it's all you deserve. I don't think Putin is so much backing Trump here. He is, in the rather cruel way that he sometimes does, basically rubbing the salt into the wounds of Greenland. Anyway, there we are. That is going to happen. I mean, the story is not over. It is very, very far from over. In my opinion, if anything, it has probably only started. I don't know the speed at which this is going to play out. And of course, it may be that there are other issues that stand in the way of the completion of this process. Some are saying that the Congress, the US Congress, is unlikely to approve the money to buy Greenland. What that overlooks is the question of how much that money is. If we're talking about $1 billion, as I said in my program yesterday, the United States could find that money quite easily and comfortably out of the US defense budget. After all, they're making out that they want Greenland for defense. So you could argue that this was a valid use of the money from the defense budget in order to achieve this national security objective. Just to say, if there's an agreement, if there is indeed a deal done, then I think it is extremely unlikely, and I have to say this, that the Congress is going to reject a deal simply because there is money involved. One way or the other, provided the sums are not too absurdly high, the United States, the Congress rather, will vote the money to buy Greenland. And, well, over the last couple of days, there's been lots of commentary about all the various things that the Europeans could have done to push back against the United States. Counter tariffs, attempts to limit food imports by the United States, selling of treasury bonds, all of those things. None of these things were going to happen. The economic consequences for the Europeans of doing all of those things would have been as bad and probably worse as they would have been for the United States itself. But there was always one overriding reason why it was never going to happen, and that is that doing any one of these things would have jeopardized the existence of NATO and the US's ongoing commitment to Project Ukraine. And that, of course, is the one thing the Europeans are determined to prevent at all costs. On the topic of American gas exports, I've seen an article, I think it was in Naked Capitalism, in fact it was in Naked Capitalism, which said that it might not be quite so straightforward and simple for Donald Trump to stop LNG exports to Europe, that the companies would possibly push back. There might be legal issues involved. Once upon a time, not so long ago, I would have been fully on board with those sort of arguments. Today, it seems to me quite obvious that the United States government, certainly this administration, would quickly ride roughshod over legal issues of that kind. If there was a crisis between the United States and Europe, and the United States were to take the decision, the US government, Donald Trump, were to take the decision to stop LNG exports, they would do it. They would find some ground to do it. There would be an executive order. Donald Trump has made this whole issue revolving around Greenland an issue of national security. Personally, I think that is absurd. I think pretty much everybody thinks it is absurd. But I'm sure there's national security legislation in the United States that would absolutely authorize the president to take emergency measures to protect the security of the United States. And I suspect that Donald Trump would argue that imposing export bans on LNG to Europe would be covered by that. And given the national security significance on Greenland, of Greenland, and the courts in the United States are extremely reluctant to go against the president's findings on national security issues. And frankly, the idea that the gas companies would would decide to bring legal action against the President of the United States in that kind of scenario seems to me entirely implausible to the point of being unlikely. Obviously, there would be a significant financial cost for the United States to pay. Obviously, there would be major gyrations and problems in the financial markets, and these would undoubtedly have a very big impact in the United States. But there would also be major impacts in Europe too. And for the Europeans, gas imports from the United States now are an existential issue. I read somewhere over the last 24 hours that Germany now imports 96% of its LNG from the United States. So I don't think any of these options would ever have been even considered in Europe, because their priority is, as I said, to preserve NATO and to keep Project Ukraine going. But it seems to me that if there had been an economic war between Europe and the United States has by far the stronger cards. And I also feel, and I'm going to say this, that many of the people who argue otherwise and who say that Europe has stronger cards to play and that it just lacks will to play them, I think they perhaps, because some of them at least are not in Europe, don't realize quite how fragile the economic and political situation in Europe has now become. Anyway, it's academic, because the Europeans were never going to take these steps and jeopardize NATO and their relationship with the United States, and jeopardize specifically the US commitment to Project Ukraine. Anyway, there it is. That's my take on this business. A shabby, sordid affair, far from ended. I suspect we will hear an awful lot more about it over the next few weeks and months. It might not be. It's quite plausible that there will be more collisions coming in the future, just to say, between the Europeans and the Americans over this issue. But having made one big concession through Mark Rutte by agreeing that the United States can have sovereignty over its bases in Greenland, the Europeans, of course, will then agree to make whatever further concessions they have to. With someone like Trump, he can smell blood and he can smell fear, and, well, he's got the taste of blood and he can smell the fear, and if he wants to ask for more, I don't think there's any way that the Europeans are going to stand up to him. Well, with all of that, now let me return to the perennial topic of these programs, which continues to be Project Ukraine. And I'm going to return again, though with giving it less time today, to the issue of whether it is the Russians have indeed hardened their negotiating stance over the last few weeks, as it seems to me that Ushakov said, following Putin's call with Trump on the 29th of December, and as Putin also seemed to me to say when he appeared to link the question of a final settlement of the conflict in Ukraine with the much larger question of the security architecture, the renegotiation of the security architecture of NATO. Now, Gordon Hahn has responded to my comments in my programme of yesterday. And again, I would invite people to go to his absolutely essential, indispensable Substack blog to see what he says there. And on that front also, I should say that I've also had an email from perhaps the greatest veteran of analysing Russian statements and Russian comments of all, who is Ray McGovern, who was doing this thing way back in the 1960s, obviously decades before me. And, well, because I don't want to spend more time here, what I will briefly say is that, as I understand it, what Gordon Hahn is saying is not so very different from what Ray McGovern is saying. And Ray's view, briefly, is that I'm overanalyzing, that I am putting more weight in my interpretation of what Ushakov and Putin have said than their words deserve. And, well, that is always a possibility. These are just sentences that the two men have made in comments. In Ushakov's case, he was repeating words that Putin apparently made to Trump. But there is always a danger of over-analysis and over-interpretation. And I would also add to that over the last couple of days, I've had an email from someone else, someone with Russian sources, and this person has told me more about the Russian response to the attack on Valdai, which is, he says that it's well known within the political elite in Moscow that Putin was absolutely furious following that attack. He saw it not just as an attack on him personally and a breach of faith, but also an attack on some members of his family, including specifically one of his daughters, who was at that time resident in Valdai, and that he has been more angry over this episode than ever any other that has taken place recently. Now, and in recent years. Now, about that, of course, I should say that I got that email a short while ago after I made my initial comments. But the great danger of basing too much on it is that it provides confirmation. It risks confirmation bias, because I think that Putin is hardening his position because he's angry about Valdai. Now that I have a message telling me that he's angry because of Valdai, that can easily be made to strengthen my view that he is hardening his position as well, which is, if you think about it, it's ultimately circular logic. So this is difficult, and this is all about interpretation. I still hold to my view. The reason, briefly, is that my sense of the Russians is that they are very, very careful what they say. And certainly in Ushakov's case, he is, in effect, discussing what Putin himself said to Trump. And I would have thought that the Russians would have been careful preparing in advance what Putin would say to Trump on this type of issue, about them taking back some of the concessions that they had made in the past. But as I said, the danger of over-interpretation exists. One must acknowledge this. And, well, both Ray McGovern, Gordon Hahn, insightful and massively experienced commentators. You can read the words that Ushakov said. They're there on the Kremlin's website in his discussion of the telephone call between Trump and Putin on the 29th of December. You can check out yourself what Putin himself said in his speech to the ambassadors, and everybody must come to their view. We are likely to get some clarification over the next few hours because Witkoff and Kushner are traveling to Moscow, and they are due to meet Putin later this evening. It is very unclear to me at this stage what they're coming with. And to be frank, I think it's also very unclear to the Russians as well. And there was a commentary in a Russian newspaper, which I think it was Izvestia, which basically says that very thing, that for the Russians, the big issue is trying to find out what the discussions, what the ideas, what the thinking of the United States at this particular point actually is. And it was Izvestia, and we have comments also from a very senior Russian official, Grigory Karasin, the chairman of the Federation Council Committee on International Relations. He's actually been one of Russia's negotiators over the course of the last year. In the spring of 2025, he negotiated, or sought to negotiate, with the Americans the restoration of the grain deal in the Black Sea. And Karasin is a very well-connected and very, very senior Russian official and former diplomat. But anyway, his words, which were indeed spoken to Izvestia, were as follows. I personally hope that Witkoff will explain how the situation is evolving. There is evidently some kind of evolution in their, that's to say, the Americans' approaches. And he went on to say that it is no coincidence that the forum in Davos is unfolding in a highly dynamic manner we are witnessing a clash of fundamentally different views on the future of international law. But anyway, the key point is that I get the sense that the Russians are not fully clear what the Americans are up to and what the pattern of their negotiations with the Ukrainians has been. And I'm going to anticipate, and I'm going to here express my worry, which I suspect is a worry of some people in Moscow. And that is that I've discussed in many places how the way in which this negotiation, these talks about the issue of Ukraine have been conducted, how they have been conducted in a way that I have never seen happen before. We've had Witkoff toing and froing between Moscow, Washington, having meetings with Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials. We've never had a situation where everybody has been in the same room, and we've never had a situation where there have been proper teams of negotiators meeting formally in plenary sessions and discussing documents with each other. The Russians tried to set something up like that with the Ukrainians through the talks in Istanbul, which resumed in May of last year, but those talks went nowhere, and Zelensky in the autumn, last autumn, just before the end of 2025, basically called those talks entirely off. The Russians have tried to revive them. They've discussed setting up working parties. They've discussed upgrading the chief negotiators, but the Ukrainians have shown no interest. And the Russians have also tried to get the Americans to agree to put the negotiations on a more conventional basis. I quoted comments that Putin made several weeks ago after he met with Witkoff and Kushner in the Kremlin at the beginning of December, with Putin saying that he wanted proper, well-organized negotiating teams that, given the complexities and issues involved in this conflict, he knows of no other way to achieve an agreed solution. Well, that has never happened. And it does worry me, and I'm confident that it worries the Russians, that what is actually happening is that the Americans are not negotiating are not trying to mediate really between the Ukrainians and the Russians. What they're actually doing is something entirely different, which is that they're conducting one set of negotiations with the Russians and a completely different set of negotiations with the Ukrainians, and that they're promising things to the Russians and they're promising things to the Ukrainians which are in conflict and incompatible with each other. So they may be telling the Russians, for example, that they agree that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO or connected to the West in any kind of alliance, and they may be simultaneously telling the Ukrainians, yes, we are prepared to move forward in some form with security guarantees. Now, if that is indeed what is going on, then you can explain it in one of two ways. You can explain it as a result of inexperience, which is that these people, Trump, Witkoff, Kushner, aren't really experienced in this kind of high-level negotiation and don't understand that negotiations of this kind, at this level, over a conflict like this, cannot happen in this way. But of course, the other concern, and I am sure that there are people in Russia who are concerned about it, is that the Americans are engaging in duplicity, that they're stringing the Russians along, implying that there is a negotiating process that is succeeding with the Ukrainians, even as they're making agreements with the Ukrainians about which they're not telling the Russians, and the Americans might then try to present those agreements that the Americans and the Ukrainians have made with each other to the Russians as a fait accompli after the negotiation between the Americans and the Russians appears to have concluded. That would be disastrous. It would create major problems in Moscow, and I am certain that there are people who are warning Putin in Moscow that the Americans might be doing this very thing, and they will point to the way in which, the duplicitous way in which the Americans have conducted negotiations with other parties, with Iran, for example, last year. Even as the Israelis were preparing to attack Iran, the United States was setting up meetings with Iranians in Oman, and with President Maduro of Venezuela, who was also engaging in negotiations and discussions with the Americans, even as the Americans were secretly negotiating with members of his government in order to remove him. As to that, we now have, by the way, confirmation, or at least information from The Guardian. It now has clearly said, The Guardian is clearly saying that Delcy Rodriguez was indeed engaged in secret negotiations with the United States to do deals with the United States, as part of which she agreed that Maduro should be overthrown and arrested and abducted by the United States and taken to the United States. The article in The Guardian is Venezuela's Delcy Rodriguez assured US of cooperation before Maduro's capture. Sources say powerful figures in the regime secretly pledged US and Qatari officials they would welcome Maduro's departure. And we go on to read that before the US military snatched Venezuela's president Nicolas Maduro earlier this month, Delcy Rodriguez and her powerful brother pledged to cooperate with the Trump administration once the strongman was gone. 4 sources involved at high levels with the discussions told The Guardian. Now, of course, that might not be true. It might be an attempt to create trouble for Delcy Rodriguez. For the record, I think it is true. But we see that over the course of the last year, the Trump administration has a record of conducting negotiations. It's important to remember that the Americans were talking to Maduro until just a week before the operation was made to abduct him. Anyway, the United States, this administration, has a history of engaging in that kind of double dealing. You could argue that what has happened over Greenland is a further case. Instead of negotiating with the Danes, what does Donald Trump do? He negotiates with the Secretary General of NATO instead, who he says is a much more important person than the Prime Minister of Denmark. So there will be people in Moscow, undoubtedly, who will be warning Putin, who probably, by the way, doesn't need these warnings, to be extremely careful of what the Americans are up to. Now, I hope It is incompetence, or rather I should say inexperience on the American side. Obviously, the doubt that it is not must exist. One way or the other, putting aside the question of whether the Russians have hardened their line, which I, by the way, think they have, I think that Witkoff and Kushner might get a courteous reception in Moscow. It is not the Russian tradition to refuse to speak to envoys, but I suspect by now the suspicions and the doubts in Moscow, at least, will be very strong. Now, it hasn't helped matters that the Americans, that Witkoff himself has muddied the picture. He has gone out and said over the course of the last 24 hours that he believes that the issues, the questions, have been narrowed in the negotiations to a single one. He didn't identify which one. He may mean territory based on everything that the Russians have been saying. That doesn't seem to me to be true at all. There's been talk about security guarantees, for example, and the Russians will undoubtedly insist on weighing in on that. And we have statements from all sorts of Russian officials, including Putin himself, making that precise point. In fact, as of now, I'm not sure that there's been any real progress at all. Last time Witkoff met with Putin in early December, Putin apparently told Witkoff that there was a great deal in the 28 points he didn't agree with. Just saying. So Witkoff says that, but then I also understand that Witkoff is also saying that he doesn't expect a signed agreement to end the conflict before the autumn of this year. 8 months, in other words. I think that implies a prolonged negotiation process. A Russian official has again said today that the Russians are not going to entertain any temporary ceasefires whilst that negotiation process is underway. So it could be that Witkoff does understand that more substantive negotiations must take place from this point onwards. Now, Trump yesterday made very clear that he did expect to have a discussion with Zelensky in Davos. Trump gave a long, rambling, incoherent, but in some ways nonetheless very interesting address at the Davos meeting. One which, as far as I could see, telegraphed quite openly both his contempt and dislike of the European leaders, who he ridiculed mercilessly, whilst also basically telling them that in spite of everything, he still is prepared to work within the framework of NATO on the understanding that he is the boss. Anyway, but over the course of this long address, he also said that he expected to meet Zelensky today. Now, Zelensky had previously indicated that he would go to Davos. Then a couple of days ago, he said that he wouldn't go to Davos. He said that he wouldn't go to Davos because of the energy crisis in Kiev. That was more important and was taking up his time and attention. And then he also said that he would not go to Davos unless there were documents there for him to sign. And the document he seemed to have in mind was a document for an $800 million or billion-dollar reconstruction program for Ukraine. Well, Trump made it clear that he wanted to see Zelensky anyway, meet with Zelensky anyway. Apparently there were going to be no documents for Zelensky to sign, but on the mere word from Trump that he needed to have Zelensky come, that he wanted Zelensky to come, what does Zelensky do? He, of course, immediately comes running. Nothing, again, makes clearer the extraordinary extent of the imbalance of power that now exists between not just Zelensky and the Americans, but between Zelensky and his European backers and the Americans. So Zelensky comes scuttling to Davos, and he has his meeting with Trump, which lasts, well, I understand, less than an hour. It's completely unclear what the two men discussed. There was no press conference. Afterwards, Zelensky gave a press conference, an address of his own afterwards, in which he, I thought, made it fairly clear how bitterly he feels about his European allies, who supposedly are not doing enough to help Ukraine. There are some of us, of course, in Europe who feel that we have done altogether far too much. We've, in effect, wrecked our economies and made ourselves dangerously over-dependent on the United States in order to give Zelensky and Ukraine whatever they ask for. But with Zelensky, as I have discussed so many times, nothing you ever give him will ever be enough. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that there were no documents to sign. Trump says that he was pleased with the meeting. If what Ushakov said about the meeting between Trump and Zelensky on the 29th of December was Trump, saw Trump telling Zelensky to forget about a ceasefire and to move forward with negotiations to agree a final peace, then perhaps, just possibly, that is what Trump said to Zelensky when they met yesterday. Anyway, all of this leads me to the conclusion that the best that can come out of this meeting in Moscow this evening between Putin, Witkoff and Kushner is not a framework agreement or anything of that kind, but rather some move towards getting a serious negotiation, a genuine negotiation underway. And it would presumably be a three-party negotiation. The Russians, the Ukrainians and the Americans all sitting together in the same room with proper negotiating teams. And it will be over the course of those negotiations that we will start to understand whether the Russians have indeed hardened their terms in the way that I suspect. Though it's plausible, possible, that we will be getting more clarity this evening. Anyway, we will see what comes out of this meeting this evening. The Russians have given it far less attention, I've noticed, than they've given to other previous meetings of Witkoff, visits of Witkoff in the past. We will see where this goes and what comes up. In the meantime, the situation continues on the ground, and we've had further information about the Russian drone and missile strikes, the big ones that have taken place over the last few days. And yesterday in my program, I discussed some aspects of the Oreshnik system as they have been clarified for me by Professor Postol. And I also discussed the fact that the Russians, over the course of their last big strike, used for the first time the Iskander 1000 missile, a ballistic missile which has a 1,000 kilometer range. The Russians have been increasingly using the Iskander over the course of this war, and it seems to me that it is increasingly taking over from the KH-101, the air-launched subsonic KH-101, as Russia's missile of choice in the missile strikes that the Russians now launch across Ukraine. Earlier in the war, the Iskander was used mostly for tactical strikes on Ukrainian positions just behind the front line. Now it's used for deep strikes across Ukraine. Production of the Iskanders has obviously increased by orders of magnitude for this to be possible, and we see more and more variants of the Iskander starting to appear. And I discussed in my program yesterday how, because the Iskander is a ground-launched, extremely fast ballistic missile, using it works to the Russians' advantage because there is so little warning time before an Iskander strike, whereas with the earlier strikes using the KH-101 missiles launched by the strategic bombers, the Ukrainians had hours of warning time, hours of time in which to prepare. Well, it turns out that the Russians also use another system, not exactly for the first time, but for the first time in a different way. And that is that over several recent strikes, the Russians have also used the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile. Now, this is a completely different missile from the Iskander and the Kinjal. It is an air-breathing cruise missile that operates at phenomenal speeds. Some say 10 times, more than 10 times the speed of sound. I'm not going to get into the technical details, which I'm hardly the right person to talk about. But this is a cruise missile that operates at these extraordinary speeds. And as it's a cruise missile, it works in a completely different way from ballistic missiles. And it is the second hypersonic system that the Russians use in Ukraine. The other system is the Kinjal hypersonic missile, which is air-launched from MiG-31 fighter jets. The Kinjal is a variant of the Iskander missile, and it has qualities of a ballistic missile. The Zircon, by contrast, is a cruise missile, so it operates in a completely different way, and as it's hypersonic in flight, it is also all but impossible in flight, apparently, to intercept. Now, what made the latest attack different is that the Russians apparently launched the Zircon against the target in Ukraine. We're not told which target, using a mobile launcher. So the Russians have previously launched Zircon missiles against targets in Ukraine from Crimea, from the ground, but these have been launched from test facilities in Crimea from permanent launchers. Now it seems that the Russians have developed mobile launchers which can move about and hide. They can be concealed in forests and all sorts of other places, even in built-up areas, if needs be. And the result is that it's difficult to track their position, and that again makes them more difficult to intercept. And of course it makes it more difficult to destroy the launcher. If you know where the launcher is, you can destroy it. But if the launcher is mobile, then you can't at any one point in time necessarily know where the launcher is. There's been a lot of intrigue about the Zircon missile and why the Russians are using it in Ukraine. Some are saying that this is being used mostly to test the system, which is basically focused on attacking ships, and that when the Zircon does carry out strikes, it doesn't do that much damage. The Ukrainians have, of course, claimed that they can successfully intercept the Zircon missile. I don't believe that claim, by the way. Well, maybe in theory they can, but I don't myself believe that they have actually ever done so, which is perhaps not quite the same thing. But anyway, the Russians it seems, started using the Zircon missile as a cruise missile that they're going to be using against targets in Ukraine. Perhaps we're going to see a steady build-up in the use of these missiles against targets in Ukraine. And of course, that will inevitably create further massive challenges for what is left of Ukraine's air defenses. Now, Zelensky himself has said that over the course of the last big Russian drone and missile strike, the Ukrainians launched air defense missiles, and that the total cost for the Ukrainian air defense system, for the Ukrainian budget, of Ukraine's attempts to repel this combined drone and missile attack was $80 million. And, well, on the one hand, he said that Ukraine is not short of interceptors because it's received Patriot missiles interceptors from some of its allies, which is true. But of course, when he talks in this way, he is talking again about shortages of air defense missile interceptors because of the rate at which they are being expended. And he also, there are also reports in Ukraine that again, some Patriot batteries in Ukraine are once again without Patriot interceptors. The numbers of interceptors, contrary to what Zelensky is saying, have fallen to critical levels. All of this strikes me as perfectly plausible and probably true. And as we see, the Russians are now using more and more systems in Ukraine, and they are indeed steadily introducing more and more weapon systems. They've been using the Kinjal for a while, but the numbers of Kinjal missiles that are now used in strikes and the regularity of Kinjal strikes has increased by orders of magnitude since the early weeks of the war. The Russians now have brought in the Iskander to 1,000, and so far strikes with Zircon cruise missiles are few and far between, but it's likely, based on the earlier pattern, that the numbers of those strikes will increase. And the Ukrainians are now again talking about Russian preparations for further strikes with the Oreshnik system. And they are saying that the next attack might involve 2 Oreshniks being used over the course of a single strike. So, problems with the Ukrainian air defense system, energy blackouts and a crisis across Ukraine, and of that I don't think anybody really now has any doubts. That problem has not eased. On the contrary, it appears to be continuing to get worse overall. And the Russians still in the process of upgrading and increasing the level of their missile strikes in Ukraine, using extra additional missiles, new types of missiles, of which several new versions, and perhaps entirely new missiles, are being used increasingly over the course of the war. The war in the sky began to go decisively against Ukraine over the course of 2025. It seems to me that 2026 is going to get much grimmer. Now, there has been quite a lot of information from the front lines. Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which does appear to have a lot of connections with the Russian military, are claiming that the Russians are now once again pushing forward west of Gulyapolye. That after the capture of Gulyapolye, there was a period of consolidation, which is exactly what you would expect, and that is now over, and that the Russians are indeed advancing westwards from Gulyapolye. They've crossed the Ganshur River. They've established strong positions on the west bank of the Ganshur River. They're now pushing westwards. The next barrier is a railway line, by the way, which is, of course, also an important logistics artery for Ukraine, and that they will then move further westwards, presumably to the town of Orekhov. The fighting in Zaporozhye, I suspect, is going to reach critical levels again at the end of the winter, early spring. We're probably going to see a big battle for Orekhov around that time. Ukrainian supply routes there, to me, are looking very precarious. And, of course, the Russians, as I've discussed in earlier programs, have been sort of hinting that these advances that General Teplinsky's forces are carrying out south of Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, are indeed intended to begin the operation to capture the city of Zaporozhye itself. Anyway, that battle continues to be underway. There has also now, I think, conclusively been signs that the Russians are resuming their offensives north of Pokrovsk. There have been some bitter statements about the situation in Pokrovsk. Julian Repke, the German correspondent of Bild Zeitung, who is an ardent supporter of Ukraine, is extremely bitter at the way in which he feels the Ukrainian high command mismanaged the Battle of Pokrovsk and failed to do the things that were necessary to mount effective counterattacks in relation to that particular town. To be honest, I don't myself see that. Given Russian superiority on the ground, it was only a matter of time before the Russians would capture Pokrovsk, and I can't see how the Ukrainians could realistically ever expect to reverse that outcome. Julian Repke's article, however, is perhaps interesting because I suspect that we are going to start to see articles about the battle, the fighting in Ukraine over the next few days and weeks in the Western media, which will finally, though very quietly and evasively, finally acknowledge what is indisputably the truth, which is that Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are lost, that the Russians have captured both of them. Anyway, the Russians, there is now video footage, do seem to be in the process of capturing Grishino, northwest of Pokrovsk. The Russian Defense Ministry has been talking about fighting in Grishino for some time now, but we now have evidence that this fighting in Grishino is indeed taking place, and that the Russians do seem to be gradually working towards the full capture of that important village. And the Russians also seem to be pushing northwards, north of Pokrovsk, towards what I suspect will ultimately be an encirclement operation of Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka, the town to the west of Pokrovsk, appears to be the place where the most intense fighting in Ukraine is taking place at the present time. There are many reports that the Russians have now started operations in the western part of Konstantinovka. There's said to be fighting going on in a village called Ilinka, which is actually a western suburb of Konstantinovka itself. The two form a single built-up area. And perhaps most evocative of all, the Russians have published footage of bombs, fab bombs, striking big buildings in western Konstantinovka. This is the area where the high-rise buildings in Konstantinovka are concentrated. It is presumably, therefore, if you like, the citadel area of the town, and it looks as if the Russians are primarily focused on that part of Konstantinovka now. They also seem to be very active. Their drones are now very active, stopping the supplies into Konstantinovka from the north, with the Russians now positioned to the east and west and south of Konstantinovka. Supplies to Konstantinovka can only come through a single important road from the north, from Kramatorsk. And of course, the Russian drones are very active on this road. And over time, of course, the effect of that will tell. The Russians are also active in the Siversk and Liman areas. And I believe that fighting is definitely going on in in Liman. The fighting in Liman reminds me of the fighting in Siversk, where street fighting took place simultaneously with the Russians working to cut the supply roads. Liman is a bigger place than Siversk. So anyway, perhaps it's a more complicated battle there. And perhaps most intriguing and mysterious of all, the Russians continue to work methodically, but rather incrementally, to expand what they call their buffer zones in Kharkiv and Sumy region. They seem to be gradually taking more territory there, step by step. It's not a big, dramatic offensive. I can't help but think that this is preparing the ground for something big in the north, but I don't know exactly what. And, well, the Russians, as I've said many times, don't share their information with me. I noticed that both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, appear to have stopped discussing Kupiansk. So for the moment at least, it looks as if the fighting in and around that town, if there is any fighting in the town, the Russians deny it, has now basically come to an end. Anyway, there it is. So the Russians are continuing to crack Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. They've taken Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka and Liman are next. We will see what the next stage is. There's still the mystery about what's happening to the Ukrainian troops, who the Russians say are surrounded on the east bank of the Oskol River, in the Kupiansk area. I suspect that in a few weeks' time, things are going to start to move more rapidly, but the focus perhaps now should be on two places, Orekhov and Konstantinovka. That is where the big battles currently are taking place. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Obviously, tomorrow I'm going to discuss in much more detail what happened between Witkoff, Kushner and Putin. We are promised that Ushakov will again give us an update. So this evening, apparently quite late this evening, we will have more information about what took place. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.